Hi there, I'm Linda and this is Huttons Valley Permaculture. I've been harvesting lots of potatoes and onions lately, and because my pantry doesn't stay all that cool, even in winter, I find that they don't last long. These garlic, which I harvested back in November, are already showing signs of deteriorating. In today's video, I'll share with you the different methods I used to preserve these three vegetables. I'll start today with the potatoes, but if you find you'd prefer to skip ahead to the onions or the garlic, check the description and I'll leave the times that you can find each of the different methods. First up, we're going to start with parboiling the chips. Now the potatoes I usually select for those are fairly long, so they give you a nice sized chip. Before you get started, get a pot of water on to boil and then peel your potatoes. I cut them fairly thick because I find that it's just easier to manage with the parboiling, but you can cut them thinner if you'd like. Add the potatoes to the boiling water, and I usually keep them on for about 3 minutes for this size. If you've cut them smaller, you might want to just keep them on for 2 minutes. You don't want them on too long because they do start to fall apart. Leave them on the heat for the allocated time, but I don't worry too much if it hasn't returned to the boil before the time is up. All you do then is drain them and leave them to steam and cool. While they're cooling down, we'll move on to the roasting potatoes, which is exactly the same method, except you cut it to kind of the roasting size. And instead of leaving it in the hot water for 3 minutes, you leave it in for a bit longer, say 4 or 5 minutes. Now I leave it on the heat. It will start to reboil, but the time I leave it on is from when I put it back on the heat. It will only be boiling part of the, say, 4 or 5 minutes that you're leaving it, and that will be fine. I usually throw them around a bit, and if they've kind of got scuffed up edges, you know that you've boiled them perfectly. If they remain unmarked, then you could have gone a little bit longer. We'll leave those to cool. Now that the chips are nice and cool, I'm just going to spread them out on this tray. It has a silicone lining, and this will all just go into the freezer. And I just sort of spread them out so that they're touching as least as possible. And that's ready to go in the freezer. And the same with the roast potatoes. I've got a different silicone sheet, and you just spread those out as well. Put that down there. Now if I've got a couple of trays to go in, I just put a silicone sheet in between and just pop the other tray on top, and that freezes well. Now I'm going to make some mash, and I generally use these Pontiac potatoes because they give a nice creamy mash. I make mine dairy free, so instead of butter and adding milk, I add tallow and reserve some of the cooking water to get the consistency I like. Just remember to season it well. I just use a bit of salt and pepper. All I do then is spread it in a lined tray and leave that to cool. Before putting it in the freezer, I'll just score it into serving size portions. The fourth method of preserving potatoes that I usually use is by making gnocchi. Now I'm not going to make it today, but I will show you a batch I have in the freezer. Now they're not really traditional gnocchi shape. I have to have gluten-free, and this batch didn't quite work out, so I just kind of did them the best I could. But they still taste like beautiful gnocchi, but it's a really good way to preserve your potatoes. It does use grains and eggs as well, but lots of potatoes and tastes delicious. I usually bag that up and keep those in the Ziploc bags as well. Now I do have a few freezers that allows me to store produce this way. In here I've got some roasting potatoes and some of the chips in there as well. Normally when I cook these, I'll just take them straight out of the freezer and put them into a hot tray with oil on it already and just fry them up like that. Down here I have my mash in portions all ready to reheat. I usually use the microwave for that, but you could leave it to defrost and just warm that up in a pan, and that would work quite well too. Now let's talk about my garlic. I've grown the two different varieties, but neither of them have really lasted very well this year. And I think I'll try some different varieties for next year. So I'll be looking for some ideas. If you know of any great varieties that keep well, please let me know down in the comments. But with this lot, I will be making some fermented garlic paste. I made this batch last year from fresh garlic, and I'll show you that process now. The recipe calls for about 8 heads of garlic. I just multiplied up my recipe to kind of match the amount of garlic that I needed to preserve. We just need to pop this into the oven. It's got to be a really low oven, about 90 degrees Celsius or 70 if you've got a fan forced. And we're just going to leave those in the oven for up to 1 hour. The cloves have been in for about 50 minutes and I'm just going to test some. You can feel it slides. There we go. That's come out now, so I can get the rest of them out of the oven and get going with getting these skins off. The standard recipe is 8 heads of garlic, 2 teaspoons of salt and 1 lemon, just the flesh, so you remove the rind and the seeds. With my garlic, I'm kind of having to guess because they're very small cloves, most of them, and it's hard to kind of round up and decide how many cloves that was. So just keep in mind the recipe when you're making it for yourself. All we need to do now is add all of this to our food processor. And now we just whiz that up into a paste. You may need to scrape down the sides and give it an extra whiz just to make sure everything's mixed properly. All we need to do is add that to a jar and try and pack it in so that there's no air pockets. When your jar's as full as you'd like, I usually use a chopstick and just go through the jar and get out all the little air pockets. And now I want to exclude air, so I'm just going to pop this little jar on top and press that down, and that will really keep most of the air out. And just the lid on, just loosely. I managed to pack a smaller jar as well. Once you've got your lid on loosely, just leave this aside. It's going to take 2 or 3 weeks to ferment, and if you leave it on a plate, that will collect any of the liquid that can bubble out of it. I'm just going to put this at one side of my bench, which will be out of the sunlight, and then once it's ready, I'll put it in the refrigerator. Having this fermented paste in the refrigerator makes it really easy. About half a teaspoon of the paste equals a clove of garlic. So now that I've done all the fiddly getting the skins off, it just makes it really quick and easy for future cooking. Another great way to preserve your garlic is by making a powder. I made a video on making this one, so let's check that out now. Start by peeling the garlic. I was using very fresh garlic here, so I had to clean them up a bit. Whiz them up into a paste in a food processor, then spread out onto dehydrated sheets. I then left the sheets in the dehydrator overnight on about 52 degrees Celsius or 125 Fahrenheit. The garlic's all dry and crispy now. So all you have to do is pop that into your food processor. Make sure that that's clean and dry. I usually put it onto one of my baking sheets to tip it in there because it can get a little messy. That's all in there. Now we just need to whiz that up into a powder. It's had a chance to settle now, so I'll just open that up and see what we've got. And then we have our garlic powder. Again, I just use a silicone sheet to get it into my jar. And there we go, some garlic powder so that we haven't wasted those bulbs that were really needing to be used up. Another way you can preserve garlic is by making a batch of fermented garlic in honey. Now, all you need to do is peel your garlic, put it in a jar, and top it up with some raw honey. The small amount of liquid in the garlic actually helps the honey start to ferment. Make sure all the garlic is covered, and it takes sort of up to a month of just sitting in the jar and just turning occasionally and perhaps even burping it a little bit to ferment properly. I'm not making a batch today because, as you can see, I've already got a big jar of it, but I will leave a link to a website that explains how to do this. You can cook with the garlic, and it gives quite a unique flavour to your cooking, and people use it medicinally as well, just by eating the garlic and also drinking some of the liquid just when you need a bit of an immune boost. And the final thing that I do to preserve garlic is just simply to break it into its cloves, leave the papery bit on the clove, and just pop those in the freezer. You grab that out and the paper peels off really quickly once it's defrosting, and I'll use that in my cooking for a great garlic flavour. Now we're going to move on to preserving onions. I've got 4 different methods of preservation for you today. One of them I've already filmed, and that's pickling. Now, I pickled some sliced onions and some little baby onions in a video recently when I did my big onion harvests, and I'm going to show you that now. So first up, we're going to make our quick pickle. Now, I've already peeled my onions and then sliced them. You can finely slice them or sort of do thick slices, whatever you like. I've kind of done in between. Then you need to make your brine. For the brine, I'm adding 2/3 of a cup of white vinegar, 1/3 of a cup of apple cider vinegar, 1 tablespoon of salt, 1 tablespoon of mustard seeds. Then I'll put this on the stove and bring it to the boil. Now, other ingredients I've got here is a clove of garlic. That was fairly large, so I've quartered it. And you can add in whatever herbs you like. In this case, I've just got some oregano. And then it's just a matter of assembling it. So I'll put some onion in my jar, add in some herbs and some of the garlic, and just keep filling the jar up with your ingredients. Make sure it's pretty firmly packed. Then all you need to do is pour on your hot brine. I'll give it a swirl to make sure I get those spices off the bottom and into the jar. Lid on, and then I kind of just shake it around just to move some of those spices through the liquid. And that's our quick pickle done. So the quick pickle is, as the name suggests, really quick. The slow part is waiting to eat it. So it's probably best to wait for 5 to 7 days for the flavours to develop a little bit. But you can start to, give it a try a bit earlier if you're really keen to get going. That one is best kept in the refrigerator. Now I can move on to the next recipe, which isn't quite as quick. It involves cleaning up all these little onions. We've got to top and tail them and then peel them. So I'm going to make a start on that. Okay, we're all done. I've got all my little onions, and while I could probably use this for onion salt, I'm not going to because I've got lots of other greens out in the garden. And these ones were actually a little bit too large for this recipe, so I'm just going to work with these ones here. I'll add some boiled water and leave it to sit for about 10 minutes. When your onions have been sitting in the hot water for long enough, this has been less than 10 minutes, so it's been about 7 minutes so far. You can peel that skin off easily. Now there is still a little bit of dirt here, which I'll be rinsing all of these onions once they're all peeled, just to make sure that I've got all those little bits of dirt off. So all I've got to do now is make my way through this bowl of onions. Now I think I will just drain the rest, and then they should be good to peel. Okay, we're all done. There is a little bit of dirt on these onions, so I'm just going to give them a rinse before we proceed. Once the onions are clean and dry, the next step is to sprinkle the salt, which is 1.5 tablespoons, over the onions, and then cover and put in the refrigerator overnight. Making the brine for this recipe is very similar. I've got 500 ml of white vinegar. I've got about 50 ml of balsamic vinegar. Now the recipe actually calls for malt vinegar, but because I'm celiac, I can't have that. So I'm just kind of making up a different recipe. And I'm going to add in 450 ml of my homemade apple cider vinegar. Now I'm not sure how this will go with these different vinegars, but hopefully it'll be okay. And then you add in your spices. That's a teaspoon of black peppercorns, teaspoon of mustard seeds, you can use any colour, a teaspoon of dried chilli flakes, actually I don't want to waste any of those, and a teaspoon of my homegrown coriander seeds. Now the recipe calls for 160 gram of sugar, but I'm just halving that. I don't like to use too much sugar, so I'll see how I go. The sugar's not needed for preserving, it's the acid from the vinegar that will preserve the onions, so that doesn't affect that at all. Now we do have to heat that and just give it a bit of a stir just to make sure the sugar dissolves. It doesn't need to come to a boil, just so long as you've dissolved that sugar, and then that's ready to use. Here are my little onions. They've been in the refrigerator overnight with the salt, and I've taken them out, rinsed them off, and I've just kind of gently dried them in this old tea towel. Now I'm just going to pack them into these sterilised jars. I've had the jars in the oven for about 10 minutes. The little ones help fill in the gaps for the big ones, I think. I've managed to fill 6 jars, so now I just need to add my pickling liquid. Now let's top up any. Now there's various spices left in the bottom of my saucepan, so I'm just going to get a spoon and spoon those evenly into all the jars. And just to put the lid on. I'll be keeping the onions in the refrigerator because I changed the recipe to different vinegars. If you use all malt vinegar as the original recipe had, you could water bath can these jars so that they are fine to store in the pantry at room temperature. The next way I'm going to preserve some onions is by dehydrating. I checked through my piles of onions the other day and found that these white ones were starting to look like they were breaking down a little bit on the outside. So I don't want to waste them. I thought today I would chop these up and then get them into my dehydrator. To dehydrate onions, it's simply a matter of peeling them and either slicing or chopping them into the desired size. Then pop them on your trays. I've just got a silicone mat on my trays just to help stop any sticking, and they work really well. Just put that in the dehydrator at 125 degrees Fahrenheit or 52 degrees Celsius for 10 to 18 hours. Just keep checking on them to make sure that when they're ready. Once your onions are all dry and crispy, just put them into an airtight container. I like to use a glass container with the lid firmly on. Another great way to preserve onions is in an onion salt. Now it uses both green onions and also brown onions and tastes great. I made a video of this recently, so let's have a look at that now. I've got 1 brown onion cut into quarters, 5 cloves of garlic and around 20 grams of chives, 300 grams of onion greens which have all been cleaned and washed. All we do now is add them to the food processor. roughly chopping the chives and greens. Whiz it all up until it's a nice green paste. Evenly distribute your mixture across your sheets and just spread it out. Now that all the mixture is spread out onto the dehydrated sheets, I'm going to get that into the dehydrator. My onions have been dehydrating for the 6 hours now, so they're really dry. All we need to do now is whiz them up. I find putting them onto a big sheet like this makes it easy to get it into your food processor, and you don't kind of drop so much around the place. You just need to mix that up into a powder now. Now, sometimes I just put a cover over it because you do get a lot of powder coming out, and I'll wait a little while before I open that up. Now, the other ingredients we need is 200 grams of salt. A sea salt is good. And in here I've got 2 tablespoons of a seaweed. Dulse flakes are good and what I prefer to get, but sometimes I can't get it. So today I'm just adding some sea vegetable. They're a bit too large for the salt, so I do whiz it up into a little spice mixture, and it gets it a lot finer, which is better for a salt. Lots of powder comes out. That's all the onion all whizzed up. So we just need to add these other 2 ingredients and virtually just stir it in. So just a bit more of a whiz and we are done. So once again, back onto your silicone sheet or a bit of baking paper or something just to make this easier. Then just into a really dry jar. Now I find onion salt is a great flavouring for any dishes. I like to use it to season meats before I grill them. I use it on top of eggs or anywhere you want that little onion flavour. And the seaweed just adds to the nutrient value of your salt. Okay, so that's a really great way to use up some of those old onions that might be growing in your garden. So give that a try, you'll find it's really delicious. Now you can also chop up onions and freeze them, and usually I put those in soups or stews. And you can also just make onion powder, similarly to the garlic powder that I've shown you earlier, which is easy to throw in recipes as well.